My name is David Carter. I walked into my younger brother's wedding, the one I had quietly helped pay for more than once, and the room froze. The music stopped. Every head turned. His eyes locked on mine, and for a heartbeat I saw the brother who once swore he'd never forget what I'd done for him. Then his voice shattered the silence for everyone to hear. "You're not invited. Get the hell out." I didn't argue. I just looked him in the eye, turned, and sent a single message to the wedding coordinator. Minutes later, the perfect day they thought was untouchable began to crumble. The hum of whispered conversations died down the moment I stepped into the hall. I could feel every set of eyes turning toward me, the air shifting from warm celebration to something colder, sharper. The resort ballroom was draped in white and gold chandeliers scattering soft light over the crowd. But all I saw was my younger brother standing at the altar, his face hardening the second he noticed me. Matthew paused mid-sentence, his hand tightening around the microphone. His bride glanced between us, confusion flickering in her eyes. Then his voice cut through the room like a blade. "You're not invited. Get the hell out." For a second I thought I had misheard him. The words hung there, echoing against the high ceiling, slicing through the delicate strains of music still playing faintly in the background. Guests shifted in their seats, some turning to one another in disbelief, others frozen with their champagne flutes halfway to their lips. I stood at the back, a few steps inside the door, trying to process how my own brother could throw me out of his wedding in front of nearly 200 people. My jaw tightened, but I didn't say a word. Years of keeping my composure in boardrooms had taught me that silence could be more powerful than any retort. I let the sting of his words settle in. The room watched as the whispers began to ripple through the crowd. A woman in a green dress near the aisle covered her mouth. Someone near the bar muttered under their breath. The officiant glanced uncomfortably at Matthew, shifting the binder in his hands. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I refused to give him the spectacle he wanted. I locked my eyes on his steady and unflinching, letting him see that I wasn't going to beg, argue, or make a scene. For a brief moment his gaze faltered, and I caught something there. Maybe guilt, maybe uncertainty, but it vanished as quickly as it came. The distance between us felt miles wide, even though it was only a stretch of polished marble floor. My mind raced through the years we had shared, the times I had been the one to show up when no one else did, the sacrifices I had made. But that wasn't a story anyone here knew, not yet. To them, I was just the older brother being told to leave. I glanced around the room. The decor was immaculate, the flowers fresh and expensive, the light perfectly staged for photographs. I noticed the bar tucked into the far corner, the DJ booth elevated slightly above the dance floor, the uplighting casting a warm glow against the draped walls. I also noticed the wedding coordinator standing discreetly by the side doors, a headset pressed to her ear. She had been the one sending me invoices for weeks. I gave her the smallest nod, a signal only she would understand, then slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers moved without hesitation, typing a short, precise message. She glanced at her screen, looked back at me, and gave the slightest incline of her head before walking briskly toward the service corridor. I turned toward the exit, the murmur of voices swelling behind me as I walked away. My shoes clicked against the marble, each step measured my posture straight. I didn't need to look back to know Matthew was watching me leave. The double doors closed softly behind me, muffling the music and the chatter, replacing them with the quiet hum of the air conditioning in the hallway. For a moment I stood still, letting the calm settle over me. My heart was still pounding, but not from shame, from clarity. There was a certain peace in knowing exactly where the line had been drawn. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and began walking down the corridor, already hearing the faint commotion starting to stir behind those closed doors. This wasn't the place or the time to tell my side of the story, but the wheels were already in motion. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing in around me, not with dread but with a quiet certainty. Whatever came next would not be loud or chaotic on my part. It would be deliberate, calculated. And it had already begun the moment I hit send. The carpeted hallway was empty except for the wedding coordinator hurrying toward me. Her clipboard tucked under one arm. She looked tense, her headset still in place, but her voice was steady when she stopped in front of me. I told her calmly to cancel every pending charge on my account. Her brows lifted slightly, but she nodded as if she had been expecting this call. I clarified that it meant open bar top-ups, DJ overtime, extra photo booth hours, valet overtime, shuttle runs after 10 uplighting add-ons, and any other overages they had me down for. In the United States, those things are billed only if they are used, and if the balance is not approved and paid, the vendors stop them immediately. She glanced around, lowering her voice, and confirmed that she could have each department notified within minutes. I took the pen from her clipboard and signed the authorization without hesitation. It was a short form, just enough to confirm I was the primary cardholder for those charges. She flipped her radio on and began issuing quiet instructions, her tone all business. From where we stood, I could see the service hallway leading back into the ballroom. Staff were already moving with a different kind of energy, subtle but focused. A bartender disappeared behind the counter with a stack of glassware. One of the AV technicians hurried toward the DJ booth with a folded slip of paper. I leaned back against the wall, hands in my pockets, and waited. It didn't take long. Through the half-open service door, I caught sight of the main bar. The bartender set down the bottle he had been pouring from, leaned toward a small group of guests, and said something I couldn't hear. Their faces shifted almost instantly from confusion to disbelief. One man looked down at his empty glass, then back at the bartender, his lips forming the words "open bar" before glancing toward the head table. The ripple began small, just a few guests exchanging puzzled looks, but it spread quickly. I saw the best man glance toward Matthew, who was trying to stay focused on whatever the officiant was saying. His jaw twitched when the DJ leaned down to hear something from the AV tech, then gave a curt nod. The coordinator returned to my side, her expression unreadable. She informed me that the open bar had been closed, the photo booth timer was set to end in 10 minutes, and the DJ had been instructed not to play beyond the contracted hours. The valet service had been told to pull the second shift, meaning anyone leaving late would have to retrieve their own cars. The shuttle drivers were on their last scheduled run before 10. I thanked her, my tone even. This wasn't about creating chaos for the sake of it. It was about boundaries. Every one of those services had been something I had agreed to cover, not because I had to, but because Matthew had asked and I had wanted to help. That generosity had limits, and he had just shown me exactly where they ended. The hum of music and muffled voices carried faintly from the ballroom. I imagined the moment people began to realize the change. The second round of cocktails they had been expecting would now be cash only. The photo booth line would close before the cake was even cut. The late-night sliders and snacks would never appear. I could almost hear the whispers, starting guests asking each other why. Maybe some would assume it was a budget cut, a mistake, a miscommunication. But a few, especially those who knew me well enough, might suspect there was more to the story. I didn't need to explain myself to them now. The coordinator gave me a quick update that she would remain on site in case any vendor tried to push for payment later. I told her that was fine and slipped my phone back into my pocket. She returned to the floor, her professional smile back in place, blending seamlessly into the hum of the event. I stayed in the corridor a few minutes longer, listening. There it was again, the slight shift in energy that comes when something doesn't go as planned. A murmur here, a louder question there. Somewhere inside, a chair scraped against the floor. The music paused for a beat too long before starting again. A subtle sign the DJ had just received the new instructions. I straightened my jacket, turned toward the side exit, and stepped outside into the warm Charleston evening. The air smelled faintly of salt from the nearby harbor, and the distant sound of water lapping against the docks was a sharp contrast to the tension building inside. I walked slowly toward the parking area, letting the quiet settle in. The night was far from over, but for now, the first move had been made. I walked away from the edge of the ballroom and into the crisp night air, the sound of muffled music and laughter fading behind me. My hand was still warm from signing the paperwork with the coordinator, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Standing there under the soft glow of the parking lot lights, a memory pulled me back almost 2 decades to a day when my brother was 18 and the world was still wide open for him. It had been the last week of August. Matthew's acceptance letter from the University of North Carolina sat proudly pinned to the fridge, its edges curling from the summer heat. Our parents were proud but cautious. Money was always tight in our house, and I could see the unspoken question in their eyes. How were we going to afford 4 years of tuition, rent, books, and everything else? That's when I told them not to worry. I had a steady job by then, a decent salary, and I promised I would take care of it. All of it. When we loaded his bags into the back of my old Chevy Silverado, I remember thinking how small he looked next to that big pile of belongings. He was excited, trying to hide his nerves, but I could read him like an open book. The drive to Chapel Hill took 4 hours, and most of it was filled with his chatter about what classes he'd take, what clubs he might join. I didn't tell him I had already set up automatic payments for his rent, arranged a meal plan, and bought his textbooks in advance. I wanted him to focus on being 18, not on calculating which bills could wait. The first semester tested him in ways neither of us expected. College life was overwhelming, too much freedom, too many temptations. I'll never forget that night in November when the phone rang at 12:43 a.m. A voice I didn't recognize told me Matthew had passed out in the hallway after a dorm party and campus security didn't know what to do with him. I pulled on a sweatshirt, grabbed my keys, and drove through freezing rain for 2 hours. When I arrived, the dorm smelled like a mix of stale beer and microwaved ramen. Matthew was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, his cheeks flushed and his eyes glassy. He looked up at me and tried to smile, but it came out crooked. I didn't lecture him. I just helped him to his feet, wrapped his coat tighter around him, and got him into the passenger seat of my truck. The ride back to his apartment was silent except for the sound of the rain hammering the windshield. That wouldn't be the last time I came to get him. There were nights when he called because his car had broken down in the middle of a grocery run, and I'd send him money for the tow truck before he even hung up. I covered late utility bills, wired cash for groceries when his meal plan ran out, and once when his laptop died right before finals, I drove down with a replacement I had picked up that same afternoon. I never made him feel like it was a debt. My only rule was that he had to focus on school and make it to graduation. He told me once during his sophomore year that I was the only person who truly believed in him. We were sitting on his old couch, a mug of coffee in his hands, the hum of the refrigerator in the background. I didn't think much of it then. Now, years later, those words feel like they belong to someone I no longer recognize. By junior year, the university billing office knew me by name. Mrs. Kelly, the woman who managed tuition accounts, would call at the start of each semester just to confirm the payment had gone through. She once told me it was rare to see a student's account kept in perfect standing for 4 straight years, especially without loans. I never told Matthew that. I didn't want him to feel pressure. The care packages became a tradition, boxes stuffed with protein bars, instant coffee, a fresh hoodie or two, and Whatever else I thought might remind him someone was in his corner. His calls after receiving them were always short, but I could hear the gratitude tucked between the words. Then came his graduation day in May. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of blooming magnolias. I stood in the crowd clapping when his name was called. His gown hung slightly crooked, his hair a little too long, but his smile was pure pride. I thought about all the overtime hours I had worked, the weekends I had skipped out on plans just to make sure every bill was covered. In that moment, it felt worth every sacrifice. A week later, I received a letter from the dean's office. It wasn't long, just a formal note thanking me for ensuring all payments were made on time, acknowledging that it had allowed Matthew to complete his degree without financial interruptions. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter, the late afternoon light striping the countertop, feeling that rare, quiet satisfaction of having kept a promise no one else had to see to know was real. That chapter of our lives had ended, but it had shaped everything that came after. I thought of it now, here at his wedding, because it was proof of something unshakable. Back then I had been his anchor, and anchors once cut loose tend to drift. Inside the ballroom, the music swelled again, pulling me out of the memory. The night in Charleston was warm, the kind that clung to your skin. Somewhere in that room, my brother was smiling, pretending I didn't exist. And out here, I was remembering every reason why I had once believed in him, and every reason why I no longer did. After graduation, Matthew came back to live with our parents for what was supposed to be a few weeks. Those weeks turned into months, and I watched him sink deeper into that restless haze of being 22 with a degree but no direction. He'd sleep until noon, scroll through job listings half-heartedly, and mutter that the economy was impossible. I understood the market was tough, but I also knew you had to push through. 6 months in, I got a call from Greg, an old college friend who now ran a mid-sized marketing firm in Charlotte. He mentioned they needed a junior account manager. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. I told him I had someone in mind. Convincing Greg was easy. Convincing Matthew to show up on time for the interview was harder. The morning of, I drove over to our parents' place at 8 sharp, coffee in hand, only to find him still in bed. I yanked the blinds open and said, "This is not optional." He groaned but got up. On the drive there, he asked if I thought he'd actually get it. I told him I wouldn't have set it up if I didn't believe he could. Greg liked him. He was rough around the edges but personable, and I vouched for him. That vouching wasn't just casual either. Greg asked me flat out if I'd stake my reputation on Matthew. I said yes without hesitation. 2 weeks later, Matthew started at the firm. At our first family barbecue after he got the job, he stood up with a beer in his hand and told everyone I was the only reason he was working there. It was one of those rare times he looked me in the eye with gratitude. A few months into his job, he called me one night, buzzing with excitement. He and 2 co-workers were thinking of launching a small tech startup on the side. They needed seed money. The bank wouldn't give them a full loan without a guarantor, and none of their families could or would step in. He said he needed me to co-sign for $20,000. My first instinct was caution. $20,000 wasn't pocket change, and co-signing meant if they defaulted, the bank would come after me. But then I thought about how hard he'd worked lately, how proud he seemed. I didn't want to be the one to dampen that fire. We met at a small coffee shop downtown to talk through the detail. He had a folder with projections, mock-ups, and a business plan that was surprisingly polished. I asked the questions I knew the bank would ask. He had answers for most of them. There was still risk, but it felt calculated. At the end of the meeting, I told him I'd do it. He leaned back, relief washing over his face, and said I wouldn't regret it. I wanted to believe that. The day we went to the bank, the air was heavy with that mix of hope and tension. The loan officer slid the papers across the desk. My name and signature would be the safety net if things went wrong. I looked at Matthew, and for a moment I saw the same 18-year-old who once said I was the only one who believed in him. I signed. He clapped me on the back and said we'd toast to this someday when they made their first million. The first few months after that were filled with texts from him about late nights coding meetings with potential investors and small wins that kept them moving forward. I sent him encouragement when he hit roadblocks. It felt good to see him building something of his own. At Thanksgiving that year, he brought a bottle of good whiskey to the table and poured me a glass first. He told our relatives that none of what he was doing would be possible without me. My mother smiled, my father gave me a rare nod, and for a brief moment the family felt united around something. But over time, the updates became less frequent. When I asked about the startup, he'd give vague answers or change the subject. I figured they were just keeping things close to the chest, not wanting to talk until there was more to share. Still, a part of me wondered if something was wrong. One evening, months later, I was leaving the office when I got a call from the bank. It wasn't a collection call, not yet, but the officer wanted to confirm some details about the loan. They mentioned late payments. My chest tightened. I called Matthew immediately. He assured me it was a misunderstanding, that a client payment had been delayed, but everything was fine. I wanted to press harder, but his tone made it clear he didn't want to discuss it. That night, I sat on my porch, glass of whiskey in hand, thinking about the arc of our relationship. From pulling him out of bed for that interview, to signing my name on that loan, I had been there at every pivotal moment. And yet somewhere in the space between those moments, something had shifted. I didn't know it then, but the trust I had given so freely was already being tested in ways I couldn't yet see. It started with small things, the kind you could ignore if you didn't want to see the pattern. Calls that used to last half an hour became quick check-ins barely 5 minutes before Matthew had to go. His texts grew shorter, too stripped of the easy banter we once had replaced with clipped updates about work or vague mentions of being busy. At first, I brushed it off. People grow, careers demand time, and maybe this was just the natural course of things. But the invitations began to dry up. We used to meet for lunch once a week, sometimes at the small diner near my office, sometimes at his favorite sushi spot. Those lunches stopped without any real explanation. When I invited him to join me for a weekend fishing trip, a tradition we had since he was in high school, he told me he had to attend a networking event. That became the recurring excuse: networking, business dinners, investors flying in. Mom's tone changed when she spoke about him. She'd remind me that he was under a lot of pressure, that success came with its own set of challenges, and that I should be more understanding. Laura, our sister, started echoing the same phrases as if they had all agreed on a script. The subtext was clear: Matthew's world was moving faster now, and I was expected to keep pace or stay out of the way. The first real crack appeared at a summer barbecue in our parents' backyard. The air was thick with the scent of grilled corn and ribbed cicadas droning in the trees. I arrived early to help Dad set up arranging folding chairs and stringing up lights. Matthew arrived almost an hour late, stepping out of a sleek black car with 2 men in tailored suits. They didn't fit the casual mood, and neither did Matthew's greeting. He shook hands with everyone else, introduced his friends, to our parents, to Laura, to distant relatives. When he got to me, he offered a brief nod and turned to point something out to one of his guests. I told myself not to make it a big deal, but later I overheard him in the yard near the grill. One of his friends must have asked about me, because I heard Matthew's voice, loud enough to cut through the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, say, "David's old school doesn't really understand modern business." The words were followed by laughter. It wasn't just what he said. It was the casual way he dismissed me as if I were an outdated piece of furniture in his life. I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch railing, my drink warming in my hand. Every so often, one of them would glance in my direction, smirking like they were in on some private joke. When dinner was served, I ended up across from Matthew at the long table under the lights. The conversation flowed easily on his side deal's clients' travel plans. I tried to join in once, asking how his startup was progressing. He answered in a few short sentences before turning back to the person beside him. Laura, sitting next to me, tried to pull me into a lighter topic about real estate trends, but before I could answer, Matthew cut across her, steering the conversation back to his latest contract. It was subtle, but the message was the same. What I had to say didn't matter here. Dessert was served, peach cobbler with vanilla ice cream melting in the heat. Matthew launched into a story, his hands' animated voice carrying over the table. I recognized it immediately. It was mine, something that had happened to me years ago when I was just starting in finance. But he told it as if it had happened to him, tweaking the details to make himself the hero. The punchline landed, the table erupted in laughter, and I just sat there feeling like a stranger in my own family. By then, the noise and heat felt oppressive. I set my fork down, wiped my hands on my napkin, and stood up. No one seemed to notice. I made my way around the side of the house, past the garden where Mom's roses were in full bloom, to the front yard. My car was parked under the streetlight, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the air. As I reached for the driver's side door, I glanced back through the fence slats. Matthew was still at the table, smiling, the center of attention. It struck me that he hadn't even realized I was gone. The drive home was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you replay every detail. By the time I stepped into my kitchen, the laughter from that backyard was still echoing in my head. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, and stared at the wall. It wasn't just that he had insulted me. It was the realization that this wasn't new. The drift had been happening for a long time, quietly under the surface. I had been holding on to an image of us that didn't exist anymore, one built on years of loyalty and sacrifice. Now I could see the truth. Somewhere along the way, Matthew had decided I didn't belong in the life he was building. That night, I didn't bother turning on the TV or checking my phone. I just sat there, letting the weight of it sink in. The rift wasn't a sudden break, it was the result of 1,000 small cuts I'd ignored until I couldn't anymore. A week before the wedding, an email landed in my inbox from the wedding planner. The subject line was short and oddly formal. When I opened it, the message was clear and cold. My name, she wrote, was not on the final guest list for Matthew and Claire's ceremony. There was no explanation, just a polite suggestion that I reach out to the couple directly if I had questions. At first, I thought it had to be some mistake. I reread it twice, scanning for a hint that it was a mix-up or maybe a poorly worded update. But it was deliberate. The font was crisp, the language careful, the kind of wording meant to shut down conversation before it could start. I called Matthew. He answered on the third ring, his voice flat, as if he already knew why I was calling. I told him about the email. There was a pause, the kind of pause that makes you think maybe they're searching for the right words. But his words came out sharp and final. It's better this way. And then the line went dead. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, staring at the kitchen counter. The silence in the room felt heavier than anything he had said. I could almost hear the click of the door in my mind, the one he had just slammed shut. For a few days, I tried to convince myself not to think about it. I buried myself in work, took on extra hours, avoided calls from Mom and Laura, but the thought kept returning, creeping in while I was making coffee or driving to the office. He hadn't just uninvited me. He had done it without explanation, without even pretending to care how it might feel. 3 days later, I was walking down King Street on my lunch break. It was one of those warm Charleston afternoons when the air feels thick and the sidewalks buzz with tourists. I spotted him before he saw me. He was standing outside a coffee shop, dressed sharp as ever, phone pressed to his ear. For a second I hesitated. I thought maybe I'd just keep walking. But then he glanced up and our eyes met. There was no surprise in his face, no awkward smile, just a flicker of recognition followed by something colder. He turned his back, lifted his phone a little higher, and started talking louder as if the imaginary conversation had suddenly become urgent. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. People moved around me, brushing past their chatter, mixing with the sound of car engines and the faint hiss of the espresso machine from inside. He didn't look back. He stepped toward the curb, flagged down a rideshare, and was gone before I even took another step. I stood there a moment longer, the heat pressing against my skin, the smell of roasted beans drifting from the cafe. It wasn't just avoidance, it was erasure. He had made the decision to cut me out of his wedding, and now he was cutting me out of his life in public as if to make it official. By the time I walked back to the office, my shirt was sticking to my back and my jaw ached from clenching it. That night I didn't call anyone. I didn't write an email or send a text. I just sat at my desk, the unopened wedding invitation still in the top drawer, and stared at the city lights outside my window. Somewhere down there he was still moving through the world, shaking hands, making deals, smiling for cameras. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he had decided there was no place for me. Not even in the moment most people reserve for family. I poured myself a drink and let the ice melt before taking a sip. There was no anger in that moment, not yet, just a hollow clarity. The line had been drawn, and this time it was deep enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. I waited in the corridor outside the ballroom where the carpet swallowed sound and the air felt a few degrees cooler than the crush of bodies inside. From here I could see a slice of the dance floor through the open doors. Laughter floated out brittle at the edges like glass that had been heated too fast. The wedding coordinator found me again, tablet pressed to her chest, a headset wire tucked neatly behind one ear. Her shoes barely made a sound on the carpet as she stopped at the bistro table we had been using as our command post. She said, "My team has confirmed which items are prepaid and which are variable." I replied that we would proceed exactly as discussed. I will not touch anything that was paid in advance. I am halting only the charges that bill after use. No extensions, no add-ons, no overtime. She glanced down and read back the list. Open bar after the included hours, yes. DJ time past the contract window, yes. Photo booth extra hour, yes. Valet overtime after 10, yes. Shuttle runs after 10:30, yes. Uplighting add-ons, yes. Late night snacks and coffee service, yes. I said yes to all of it. She turned the tablet toward me so I could initial each line. The stylus clicked as I marked the boxes, deliberate, steady, no tremor in my hand. She said, "For the record, this is within your rights as the payer of record. You are responsible only for the scope you agreed to in writing." I nodded. She added that her staff would inform vendors politely and follow venue protocol. No scenes, no grand announcements, just a quiet wind down of what had not yet been earned. Inside the ballroom, the timeline ticked toward 10. That was the first seam. The bartender at the far station hung a small sign on the mirror that said, "Hosted bar, concluded cash and card accepted." He murmured to the couple in front of him, and they looked back over their shoulders with the same expression people wear when a flight delay hits the gateboard. At the main bar, a woman in a silver dress blinked at her empty glass, then fished for a card she had not planned to use tonight. Two groomsmen compared tabs on their phones and tried to laugh it off. The laugh did not carry. The photo booth operator checked her watch, then moved with quiet efficiency. She zipped the prop trunk, folded the backdrop, and slid the printer into a case that had seen 100 weddings. A group in matching pastel ties queued up for one last set of strips only to find the curtain drawn. Their energy sagged and dispersed like a spilled drink creeping along the floorboards. I signed the DJ change order as the coordinator returned. She said his contracted set ends at 10:15 with a 15-minute grace period. Anything beyond that becomes overtime. I drew a line through overtime. She radioed the lead tech. The music dipped to a thinner thread of sound, then stopped as the DJ raised a hand and leaned down to speak with his assistant. He did not make an announcement. He cued a final track inside the window and began coiling cables with the practiced calm of someone who has learned to leave before the argument starts. The room changed color next. Uplights that had been painting the walls in soft amber clicked off in 2s and 3s, until only the house chandeliers remained bright and unforgiving. The magic of good lighting is that it makes a room feel like memory while it is still happening. When it goes, you notice everything. The tables looked closer together. The centerpieces looked taller. People began to see one another rather than the idea of a perfect night. Across the room, I watched Matthew make tight loops through clusters of guests, always moving, always smiling without quite reaching his eyes. Claire stayed near the sweetheart table, one hand on the back of her chair. The other clenched a little too long around a flute of champagne she was no longer drinking. A bridesmaid leaned in to say something, and Claire nodded too quickly. The valet captain approached the coordinator near our table, cap in hand. He spoke softly. The coordinator looked at me. I initialed again. Valet overtime ceases at 10. Cars would still be retrieved, of course, but the extra staff who kept the circle spinning fast would clock out. Outside, the tempo of arrivals and departures began to drag. A small line formed. An usher tried to joke that waiting built character. No one laughed. At 10:30, the shuttle driver checked his manifest with the coordinator. The last included run left-right on time, headlights sweeping across the drive as the bus rolled into the warm night. A handful of guests who had counted on late rides lifted their phones and began calling for cars. A cousin stared at her screen, watching Suji pricing climb with the same helplessness people have when the tide comes in faster than their feet can move. The caterer's captain stepped up next, professional to the bone. He confirmed that the plated dinner cake service and coffee had all been covered and executed. He asked about the planned late-night bites that had been scheduled for 11. Sliders, truffle fries, mac and cheese in tiny cups, the kind of thing meant to make people stay another hour. I signed the line that declined it. He nodded once, then directed his staff to wrap and donate what could be saved. No one raised their voice, the work simply shifted direction. I felt the pull to step into the room and announce what I had done. It would have been easy to feed the part of me that wanted witnesses. Instead, I stayed where I was. This was not a tantrum. It was a boundary made visible. A small commotion near the dance floor drew my eye. The DJ powered down his board and lifted a crate. A groomsman in a loosened tie tried to negotiate 5 more songs. The DJ shook his head, tapped the contract on his clipboard, and kept packing. The groomsman's face went pink, then slack. He turned and scanned the room like he was searching for someone to blame and could not quite find a name to fit the feeling. The coordinator returned with a printed summary for my records. She pointed to the totals. Prepaid items remained unchanged. Variable items were zeroed out past the contracted thresholds. She said again, "This is within your right." I thanked her for running a tight ship. She said we try to take care of our clients even on nights like this. Her professionalism steadied the air between us. From the doorway, I could see my mother sitting with Laura at a side table. Mom's hands were clasped knuckles, pale eyes fixed on the floral arrangements. Laura whispered something and looked toward the doors as if she knew where I would be. She did not stand. I did not move. Near the head table, Matthew finally stopped long enough to speak with the venue manager. The manager listened, palms open, then gestured toward the coordinator, then toward the back hallway. Matthew glanced that way, then looked across the room to the bar where a small line had formed. His smile tightened. He clapped the manager on the shoulder and walked away without following the gesture. I checked the time. 10:42. The room already felt different. Guests who had expected the night to build toward midnight now leaned toward exits in their minds. The string of small disappointments was doing what a single break could not. It was resetting the arc of the evening. I thought of the contracts I had read and reread when I agreed to help with the bill. Every page had a clause for variable costs. Every clause gave the payer control. I had not used that control to humiliate vendors or strand guests. I had used it to stop what I no longer owed. The coordinator asked if there was anything else. I said one more thing. Please make sure the staff knows none of this is on them. They did their jobs. She said I will tell every team. A man in a navy suit brushed past me on his way out and muttered that the music had died too early. He did not look at me. He was just giving his complaint a body to pass. Outside the doors, the air smelled like magnolia and sea salt. A couple in formal wear stood under the portico arguing in tired voices about whether to wait for their car or call a new one. The valet jogged up with a set of keys and the argument dissolved into relief. Inside, the MC tried to salvage the mood with a toast that did not require a microphone. Glasses clinked dully. A few guests who had not noticed the shift looked around as if someone had dimmed a sun that only they could see. The dance floor emptied except for two children sliding in their socks and an uncle trying to coax them toward their parents. I signed the final acknowledgement on the coordinator's tablet. She saved the document and emailed a copy to me on the spot. Her screen pinged. She thanked me and slipped back into the room to guide what remained of the schedule toward a softer landing. I stayed another minute at the threshold, letting the scene imprint. Not to savor it, but to remember the exact feel of a line held. Then I stepped away from the doorway past the marble column and the side table now stacked with folded menus and walked toward the quiet of the lobby, where the chandeliers hummed and the night staff spoke in low, even voices. The celebration would go on in a smaller shape. Mine already had. Matthew burst through the glass doors with a force that rattled the brass handles, his polished shoes striking the marble floor like hammer blows. The night air slipped in behind him, warm and heavy, carrying the muffled chatter of guests who had begun to spill toward the veranda. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, and his eyes were sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the lobby. "Are you trying to ruin my wedding?" His voice wasn't a question. It was an accusation loaded like a weapon. I kept my posture straight, my tone steady. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm stopping what I haven't paid for. If you want the extras, you can settle the bill yourself." He took 2 steps closer, close enough that I could smell the faint mix of champagne and stress on his breath. "You think this is some kind of game? Do you know how this looks?" I let the silence hang just long enough to make him fill it with his own anger. Then I said, "You remember that night in Dad's backyard? You had a burger in one hand and a beer in the other. You looked me in the eye and told me you'd never forget what I'd done for you. That I got you your first job, that I vouched for you at the bank when no one else would. You said you wouldn't forget." His jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward the veranda where a small crowd had gathered, their attention drawn like moths to the heat of the moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just let the words carry the weight they'd been holding for years. "But you did forget. You forgot the calls I answered at 2 in the morning. You forgot the nights I drove across town because you'd had too much to drink. You forgot who paid the first month's rent on that apartment you swore you'd keep for a year and barely lasted 6 months in. Matthew's hand went to his tie, tugging it tighter like he was trying to hold something in. Stop making this about the past. Tonight is about now. Exactly, I said. And right now the only thing I'm responsible for is what I agreed to pay for. You want the open bar past 10, you want the DJ to stay, you want the shuttles to run all night, then you put your own name on the invoice. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Someone near the door whispered something that made another guest cover their mouth, either to hide a laugh or a gasp. Matthew's eyes flicked toward them, then back to me like he couldn't decide whether he was more worried about the kind or the optics. You're unbelievable, he said finally, his voice lower but sharper. You show up here after everything and pull this stunt. I didn't flinch. You're right. I did show up. I showed up when you needed tuition covered. I showed up when your car broke down and you needed a ride to interviews. I showed up when you couldn't make rent and the landlord was ready to toss your things on the street. I've been showing up for years, Matthew. The difference is, tonight I finally decided where the line is. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked past me as if he might find an ally in the shadows of the lobby. But the guests who had wandered out here weren't moving to help. They were watching, listening. You think this makes you look strong? He asked, his voice trembling now, the edge of his anger fraying. No, I said. I think it makes me honest. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The murmur of voices swelled again, blending with the faint strains of whatever song was still playing inside. A woman in a pale green dress passed through the doors, glanced between us, and slowed her pace to eavesdrop. Matthew stepped back, running a hand through his hair like he could smooth the scene out of existence. This isn't over, he muttered, but it sounded weaker than he probably intended. It's over for me, I said, my tone final. What you do from here is your choice. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned sharply on his heel and stalked back through the doors, his shoulders squared but his stride too quick to be casual. The crowd thinned in his wake, some following him. Others lingering just long enough to trade low-voiced remarks before slipping back into the ballroom. I stayed where I was, the marble cool beneath my shoes, the chandelier light catching on the glass doors as they swung shut. The tension in my chest eased, not because I'd won anything, but because I hadn't backed down. Somewhere in the muffled distance of the reception, applause broke out, sudden and unconnected to anything I had done. It faded quickly, swallowed by the music, but I could still hear the faint echo of my own words in the space between beats. By the time I got back to my car, my phone was already buzzing with alerts. At first, I thought it was just the group text with a few old friends who had heard about the wedding, but when I unlocked the screen, I saw dozens of notifications from platforms I hadn't opened in weeks. Someone had posted a video. The thumbnail froze me in place. It was me in the lobby, standing with my hands at my sides while Matthew leaned in, his face twisted with anger. The caption read, "Charleston wedding turns into family feud," and it had already racked up thousands of views in less than an hour. I hit play without meaning to. The video wasn't shaky. Whoever filmed it had a steady hand and a clear shot. You could hear every word. My voice was calm, his was sharp, and the background noise of murmuring guests framed the scene like a soundtrack. It ended just after he walked away, and the comments were already piling up. Wedding shutdown and #family drama were the top hashtags under the post. People were stitching the clip, adding their own takes. Some called me petty, others called me a hero. But the ones that caught my attention were from people who knew us. Old high school acquaintances, distant relatives, even a couple of Matthew's former co-workers were chiming in. One wrote, "I don't know the full story, but I do remember David helping Matt out of a rough spot after college." Another said, "I was at that BBQ and Matt thanked his brother in front of everyone." Guess that didn't last long. I scrolled past strangers dissecting our body language, people speculating about money, about loyalty, about how a family could fracture so publicly. Then I saw a comment from a woman named Teresa. She had been in my freshman economics class with Matthew. She wrote, "I remembered David driving hours to pick Matt up when he was sick during finals week. He stayed in the dorm lounge all night just to make sure Matt was okay." That memory was so far buried I had almost forgotten it myself. By the time I got home, the story had spread beyond social media. My neighbor, who rarely even waved, was standing by her mailbox when I pulled into the driveway. She gave me a look somewhere between sympathy and curiosity, like she wanted to ask but didn't dare. Inside, I tossed my keys on the counter and poured a glass of water, trying to push the noise out of my head. But the buzz kept following me. My phone lit up again. This time it was a local news station. They had tagged me in a tweet linking to a short article. The headline was "Blunt Viral Video Shows Confrontation at Charleston Wedding Over Payment Dispute." They had clipped part of the same footage but added their own narration. It was surreal hearing a stranger's voice explain my life in 30 seconds. They didn't know the years behind it, the sacrifices, the conversations that had shaped the moment. To them, it was a story with a clean hook and an easy label. I set the phone down and stared at the wall for a while. Somewhere out there, Matthew and his bride were scrambling. I knew them well enough to imagine the scene. Her scrolling furiously, him pacing and muttering about how to get it taken down. They'd start reporting the posts, maybe even threaten the original uploader. But it wouldn't matter. People had already saved it, reposted it, spread it further than either of them could control. An hour later, a text came in from Daniel, an old friend of ours who had drifted toward Matthew's circle in recent years. Just 3 words: "Saw the video." Underneath another message: "I know you won't believe me, but you were right." It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like watching a tide come in slowly, carrying pieces of the past back to shore. Every new post, every shared memory from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reminded me how much had been overlooked or rewritten. By late evening, my phone was nearly out of battery from the constant notifications. I set it on the nightstand unplugged and let the room go quiet. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space, steady and indifferent. Outside, the street was still the kind of stillness that made you wonder how far a rumor could travel before it lost its shape. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, knowing the story had already taken on a life of its own. Somewhere, people I'd never meet were arguing about me. Somewhere, Matthew was learning that control is fragile when the truth starts slipping through the cracks. And somewhere buried in all the noise were the voices of people who had seen the whole picture long before tonight ever happened. 2 weeks after the wedding, I got the call. My mother's voice was careful, like she was stepping around shards of glass. She said we needed to talk as a family, all of us in one room. I knew it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. Still, I agreed because there were things I'd been carrying for years that deserved to be laid out in plain sight. When I pulled into my parents' driveway that Sunday afternoon, the air was thick with the smell of overcooked pot roast. Inside, the house looked the same as it always had, yet it felt heavier. My mother stood by the dining table, smoothing a crease in the tablecloth that didn't exist. My sister Emily sat across from her, scrolling on her phone without looking up. My father was in his usual chair at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes steady but unreadable. Matthew wasn't there yet. I set a slim folder on the table and sat down without saying much. When Matthew finally walked in, he didn't greet me. He dropped into a chair like he'd been dragged here against his will. I started by opening the folder. Inside were copies of receipts, bank statements, and letters, each one neatly dated. I slid the first page forward. It was the tuition bill from his freshman year at the University of South Carolina, marked paid in full with my name on the payment line. This, I said quietly, is what your first semester cost, and here I pushed the next sheet forward as the spring semester. That's housing, meal plan, textbooks, plus the $200 I sent every month for your expenses. Matthew shifted in his seat, glancing at Emily as if she might rescue him. My mother's hands stilled on the tablecloth, her fingers curling slightly. I moved through the years, one page after another. Sophomore year, junior year, senior year. The letter from the bursar's office thanking me for timely payments signed by hand. The wire transfer confirmations for his off-campus apartment deposit and rent. A printout of the Uber receipt from the night I drove to pick him up drunk outside his dorm because he was too sick to walk inside. Then came the loan documents. I slid the final set of papers across the table. This is the $20,000 business loan I co-signed for you, and this, I tapped the page, is the clause that says if you default, it becomes my debt. Matthew leaned back, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. I never asked you to keep track like this. I met his gaze. You didn't have to ask. You thanked me once at that family barbecue, remember? You said you'd never forget it. He opened his mouth, but my father spoke for the first time, his voice cutting clean through the tension. Enough. The room froze. My mother looked down at her lap. Emily stared at the far wall. My father's eyes were fixed on Matthew. I've listened to excuses for too long, he said. Your brother has carried more than his share, and you've treated him like it was nothing. Matthew's jaw tightened. This isn't fair. You don't understand how enough, my father said again, louder this time. Silence filled the space. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. My father's tone wasn't angry, but final, like a door being locked. Matthew stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked around the table, waiting for someone to stop him, to take his side. No one did. He walked out without another word, the front door clicking shut behind him. For a long time, no one moved. My mother began folding and refolding the napkin in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Emily reached for her water glass, but didn't drink. My father leaned back in his chair, his hands resting flat on the table. I gathered the papers back into the folder, each one sliding neatly into place. There was no satisfaction in it, no rush of victory. Just a steady, quiet certainty that the truth had finally been put where everyone could see it. When I stood to leave, my father gave a small nod, the kind that said more than words could. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of pine from the woods beyond the yard. I got in my car and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into something I knew would not be undone. 3 days later, I heard about the first crack. A friend who worked in corporate PR mentioned over coffee that one of Matthew's biggest contracts, a regional marketing deal with a real estate developer, was being reviewed. The client had seen the wedding video. It wasn't just the drama itself. It was how fast it had spread, the way hashtags had turned his name into a trending punchline. By Friday, the deal was gone. The news came quietly, almost politely, in an email from the client to his company. But the ripple was anything but quiet. Losing that contract meant losing more than half of his projected revenue for the quarter. Word travels fast in business, especially in a city like Charlotte, where reputations are traded like currency. That same afternoon, I got a text from an old mutual acquaintance. Did you hear your brother's investors are pulling out? I didn't answer right away. I sat there on my couch, phone in hand, staring at the message until the screen went black. 2 days later, it was confirmed. The $20,000 startup loan I had co-signed for him wasn't the only capital he'd taken on. A group of angel investors had given him seed money under the condition that he maintain brand stability and positive public presence. The wedding scandal combined with the social media blowback was enough for them to call the note early. That meant repayment in full within 30 days. Matthew didn't have it. The fallout was quick and merciless. He tried to sell off some equipment from his office, a sleek space downtown with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. But buyers knew he was desperate, and the offers were low. His staff began to trickle away each exit, making the space feel emptier. One rainy Tuesday, I happened to drive past his building on my way to a client meeting. Through the large glass windows, I saw him standing alone, arms folded, looking out at the wet streets. His reflection was faint in the glass, overlaid with streaks of rain. The lights inside were dim, desks were bare. For a moment I thought about stopping, about walking in, saying something, even if I didn't know what it would be. But I kept driving, not out of cruelty, but because I knew this was a chapter he had to read all the way to the end on his own. The calls started that week. First from mutual friends who didn't know the full story, asking if there was any way I could help him recover. Then from my mother, whose tone carried a mix of worry and unspoken reproach. She didn't ask me to fix it, not directly, but the pause before she hung up told me she still hoped I might. I didn't answer Matthew's messages. There weren't many, just a few short lines sent late at night. No apologies, no explanations, just questions like, "Do you know anyone who might buy out my shares?" or "Can you talk to the bank for me?" I read them all and set the phone down each time. The city's gossip circles did the rest. Stories about his temper with employees, whispers of unpaid invoices. The image he had built so carefully, the confident entrepreneur who always had a plan, began to fray in public view. Clients stopped calling. Vendors started demanding deposits up front. By the end of the month, he had sublet half his office space and sold his company SUV. I heard from someone in our extended family that he was back to driving the old sedan he'd used in college. The one I'd helped him buy when his first car died. One night, as I walked back to my own office after a late meeting, the rain was coming down in thin, steady sheets. I passed his building again. The lights were still on, but dim, and through the fogged glass I could see him at the window, head lowered, phone in his hand. It struck me then that for the first time in years, there was no one standing between him and the consequences of his own choices. No buffer, no rescue. I kept walking, the sound of the rain folding over the city, carrying the faint hum of traffic somewhere in the distance. The streets glistened under the street lamps, and somewhere behind me in that empty office, my brother stood alone, watching the water run down the glass. The rain had already eased by the time I reached my car, leaving only the soft drip from the trees overhead. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, not thinking about Matthew's office behind me, but about where I wanted to be next. For years, my life had revolved around the needs, demands, and crises of other people, especially his. It had become a reflex to drop everything whenever his name appeared on my phone. Now, with that weight gone, the space felt almost foreign. That night, I opened my laptop and booked a flight. Not just a weekend away, but a month-long trip with no fixed plan except to go where I had never been. I chose places that had been on my list for years but always got pushed aside for someone else's emergency. The coast of Maine in spring, the deserts of Arizona, the quiet mountain trails in Colorado. The next few days were filled with sorting out work so I could be away. I told my clients I was taking some time off and arranged for a colleague to cover urgent projects. The responses were warmer than I expected. More than one person told me I deserved it. That simple acknowledgement was worth more than I could have imagined. Packing was easier than I thought it would be. I left behind the suit jackets and ties, choosing worn-in jeans, hiking boots, and a camera I had not touched in years. The morning I left, the air was crisp, the kind of early spring morning where the sun is bright but the wind still carries winter's edge. As I loaded my bags into the trunk, I felt a strange lightness settle over me. The first stop was Portland, Maine. I spent days wandering along the harbor, eating fresh seafood at small family-run places where no one knew my name. I watched the sunrise from rocky cliffs, the ocean stretching endlessly in front of me. There was no urgency, no one waiting for me to fix something. From there, I flew to Arizona. The desert in April was nothing like I had imagined. It was alive in its own way, the air warm but not oppressive. The horizon painted in shifting shades of gold and red at sunset. I hiked trails that left my legs aching and my lungs burning, but in a way that made me feel alive instead of drained. In Colorado, I rented a cabin high in the mountains. Mornings were filled with the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant rush of a river. I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching clouds move across the peaks, feeling more present than I had in years. It was in that cabin on a quiet evening with the fireplace crackling that I realized I had stopped checking my phone for messages from him. Not because I had made a conscious choice, but because the expectation had finally faded. I thought about the years I had given, the times I had stepped in without being asked, the sacrifices I had made without hesitation. And I understood now that those choices had been mine to make, but they had never been my obligation. Helping someone is an act of will, not a debt to be collected indefinitely. And respect, I finally knew, has to flow in both directions. Without it, generosity turns into something that corrodes instead of builds. By the time I returned home, the city felt different, but maybe it was me who had changed. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted from, spent more time with people who valued my presence. For what it was, not for what it could provide. My days filled with work I enjoyed and evenings that belonged entirely to me. I still hear bits and pieces about Matthew. From what I gather, he is rebuilding in his own way, smaller now, quieter. We have not spoken since the night of the wedding, and I am not sure when or if that will change. But I no longer feel the pull to mend what has been broken. Some rifts are not meant to be closed, and that is not bitterness speaking just truth. I had spent so long being the safety net that I forgot I could step out of the circus altogether. Now I am choosing where my time and energy go. And for the first time in a long while, I am choosing me. Have you ever given everything to help someone only to be betrayed in return? What did you do when the moment came to protect yourself instead? I would like to hear your story.